Wisdom, and welcome to the SAB Goblin Raw 700 size helicopter build video. This video is going to take you through the build, including electronics install, all the way into initial test flights for the Goblin Raw helicopter. It's an extremely popular 700 size helicopter. It, although a Goblin, goes back to sort of pod and boom styles with some unique twists. I'll be building this helicopter stock for the most part. I'll make a few cosmetic, mostly, alterations along the way. Honestly, that's one of the fun parts about the Goblin Raw, is that you can make some cosmetic changes, and so they don't all look identical at the field. So one of the first things, just to get started here, that you'll notice about this kit is the quality of the manual. SAB manuals are top-notch. I think, honestly, it's some of the best you'll find in the hobby. Full color, very clear instructions, super well thought out. Some things to note as you dig in and look through the front. And again, I'll zoom into these pages as we go through the build video. But SAB is very clear. Everything's sort of color-coded here. You know, there's exclamation points when there's something they really want to call out as important. Bolts and other parts are noted in colors by the thread lockers they'd like you to use. So blue and green are the two they use in the manual. You can substitute red for green in several of these places if you want. They mention where to use CA glue and also other lubricants such as grease. So the manual is super clear, very well detailed. One other quick note, when you get your kit, you'll find a card right at the top of the box that tells you how to register your helicopter on goblinhelicopter.com. Do go ahead and do so. Occasionally, weaknesses of certain parts come out over time, and SAB is fantastic about shipping, new replacement parts if they find, a defect in a certain batch of kits, for example. Registering your kit will let SAB know where to find you should any updates or new parts need to be shipped out to you. Rare, but anyway, always nice to do. So with that, let's get into our first step, which is assembling our carbon pushrod. We're going to go ahead and epoxy the pushrod ends onto this and then set it aside so that by the time we get to that portion of the build, this will well be set. So one of the great things about SAB manuals is the way they package all of the parts align with the page number. So for example, the first page with instructions on it is page 5 in this manual. You'll see I have a large sort of pile of the bags over here to the side. But if you look for the little baggie that says bag for page 5, that'll have the pieces and parts you need. Sometimes for some larger parts, such as the pushrod themselves, it may not have a bag number, but it's really obvious this is the only long carbon rod in the box. Super well detailed. Do save these little baggies. They come in handy around the shop for a variety of things. And you're going to have a lot of them by the end of this build. So let's get into the pushrod. Fairly straightforward here. I will note that the manual talks about using CA glue to glue the ends of the pushrods on. I'm not a big fan of that. I much prefer epoxy or JB Weld. I'll be using a Bob Smith Industries 30-minute epoxy for this. You could use a 5-minute, it's just much less working time. I prefer to take my time, so we'll use the 30-minute epoxy to glue the ends on. Otherwise, it's fairly straightforward. The only other thing I'll do is use a little bit of 400 grit sandpaper, and I just like to scuff the ends a little bit. It just takes some of the smoothness off of the carbon pushrod, helps that epoxy really bite in. So let's get into the step itself. So for this step, we've taken our small pieces and parts out of the bag for page 5, and we've got our carbon pushrod here. So we're just going to take just a little bit of 400 grit sandpaper here, and I'm just really just going to roll this. I don't need to sand this much. I'm really just trying to scuff it up, and that's just going to give the epoxy a little something to bite. Same thing on the other side. Just going to roll it on the sandpaper a little bit, just to kind of scratch it up a bit. And then we'll call that good. Just going to wipe any of the dust off of there, if any, real quick with a paper towel, and that's ready to go. We've got our Bob Smith Industries 30-minute epoxy. It's a 2-part epoxy, so we're going to mix 2 equal parts of this. Now that we've got our epoxy ready, the manual calls for inserting these threaded rods into the pushrod such that 13 millimeters is exposed. So we're just going to do a quick test fit here. Feel a bit more friction this way. I think we'll go that direction. And I'm just going to roll the end of the push rod in the epoxy, kind of get it gummed up there, and then push it into, kind of push it in and out, move the epoxy in there a little bit. And then you're going to end up using a digital caliper for a number of these steps, but I preset this to 13 millimeters, so I can bring the push rod here and then very carefully push this in until I have precisely 13 millimeters sticking up. You can see that there. Always nice to have a little piece of paper towel kind of around the workbench. You'll find good uses for it here. I'm going to take this little sort of dollop of epoxy here and just sort of round it into a bit of a fillet or a rounded mound at the end there with my fingertip. And then I'm going to take my little epoxy stir stick here and I'm going to put a bunch onto that area we sort of sanded a little bit there. And there's a little metal sleeve that will protect and strengthen the end of this carbon fiber push rod that will go over this. Just going to get that good and gooped up. It's fairly long, so you know you work about a 1/4 inch or so down the push rod. Okay, set that aside. Wipe your fingers clean so you don't get epoxy residue all over the nice shiny metal part. Then I'm just going to work it down, kind of twist it around. Same thing, little epoxy sort of pulls up down here. We're just going to roll that on our finger into a nice little fillet there. And with that, our push rod is all finished, good to go. And we are going to set this aside to dry. So most epoxies cure within our initial cure just to be handled within the time frame they say. So 30-minute epoxy means, you know, I can touch this and move it around a tiny bit in 30 minutes, but really they don't gain their full strength until about 24 hours. So find a safe spot to set this, leave it aside. And if you're a power builder, you know, and get there in 10 hours, it might quite not be set yet, but within about 24, you're good to go. All right, the next step on page 6 here is our transmission group assembly. All of these parts here are in the page 6 bag, and then there's a number of smaller bags in there. And then obviously in a box is the transmission assembly. This comes pre-built from the factory. There's grease inside here already, so you don't have to do a thing. This is already Loctited in all the right places. So this is good to go. I'm just going to set that aside for now, and then we'll get into the assembly here. I'm going to go ahead and get all of these unbagged, laid out here on my mat, and then we'll continue from there. Okay, so this next step is all about assembling, or starting to assemble our transmission. We take the bushing here, slide it onto the lower shaft first, and then we'll take our main pulley here that contains the one-way bearing, and the manual calls for a little lubricant on the one-way bearing. SAB, I know, makes a specific lubricant for this. I like to use Triflow liquid lubricant for this, so I'm just going to put a little bit carefully in the one way, a few spots, and then work it in. Go. And it's important that you get these screws facing up when you slide this onto the shaft. So we'll slide this on next. Should go in fairly easily. You've got to get it kind of around the one way, and then I'm just going to work it around just to get that lubricant sprayed around in there. There we go. That's all ready to go. And then next up after that are 3 successive shims. Pretty thin little guys here, so be careful not to bend those. And again, get that paper towel nearby. So we've got the 3 shims next. So we've added our main pulley, 3 shims, and now we're going to add our front tail pulley next to the shaft. And that goes with this piece on the bottom pointing down. And there is also a hole here in the shaft that we're going to want to line up this piece with as well. So get that in just the right spot, lined up with the hole. That looks perfect. And then come to our first bolt. Now, this bolt is going into a nylon lock nut, which means there is a plastic insert inside this nut. So we're not going to want to use any Loctite here because we don't use Loctite with metal and plastic interfaces, but it's still a good idea to clean the bolt. I'm not going to show me cleaning every bolt in this build video, but we will do one quick one here. So I like to take a piece of paper towel, fold it into quarters. I take some acetone. Again, some folks will use different things, alcohol solutions, alcohol and Windex. There's a few different combinations. I just soak a paper towel here, and then I'll take a driver and grab the right size driver and our bolt, and I'll just squeeze it tightly in the paper towel, spin it, and then I'll seat it in a different spot. Clean it again. If that spot looks really dirty, I'll do it a third time. Squeak in there, and then you can see that's all the oil residue that we got off of this bolt. So this is now good to go. Let's take a quick look at the manual, make sure we've got everything oriented correctly. Does not seem to matter which end it goes through here. There's flat spots on both. So there we go. We've got the bolt here inserted through. So now we're going to take our lock nut and get that guy started here. And there's a lovely little flat spot that captures the nut right there so that it won't spin as I tighten this. And I'm just going to get that nice and snug. Don't want that coming out. Don't have to go crazy. You know, again, in any bolt in these helicopters, don't over tighten them. You know, it will just lead to difficulty down the road, or you'll strip them or round them. But obviously in some of the beefier bolts and, you know, going through your main shaft, you know, it's okay to give it a little bit of muscle on there, but don't go crazy. And with that, that's the first half of our page 6. No step numbers here in the manual, so we're going to refer to them by page numbers of the manual. And with that, I'll get the rest of the bags open and the rest of the bolts cleaned up, and we'll head into the second half of page 6. All right, I know I said I wasn't going to sit here and make you watch me clean every single bolt, but just want to talk briefly about how I do it. So for every step that I do, I'll take all the bags and dump out all the bolts for a specific step. In this case, for page 6, there's about 10 bolts here, and I'll just grab them and I soak a piece of paper towel really well in acetone, and I'll give 2 passes at every bolt. I can usually get through at least 5 on a soaking of the paper towel, but what does start to happen is that after a little while, you'll start to feel the paper towel dry out because the acetone just evaporates. So when that happens, obviously the acetone's not on the paper towel anymore. It's not doing you any good. So when the paper towel stops feeling damp, it's time to swap it out. Pour a little more acetone on it. I'll also use different sides of the paper towel, flip it around the other way and soak it, you know, unfold it and refold it and whatnot, and get all your bolts. So like here, it's starting to get a little dry. I'll refold it, grab a little acetone, pour it on there again. This dries the heck out of your hands, by the way, so you might find yourself reaching for some lotion at the end of a build day to get some of the moisture back in your hands, because it's bad for drying out your fingertips. Look at that. That's just the gunk from one tiny little screw, but that's all the stuff that will stop your thread locker from working. So you don't have to look hard to see why it's worth putting in all this work. It's a pain in the butt. I know you're excited to put the helicopter together. I am too. Believe me, as I'm doing this build video, I'm already going, why did you decide to do a build video? You just want to get this thing built, but all the extra steps for the video take longer. But no, I genuinely enjoy doing this. But I'm just saying, I get that you're in a rush too. But all it takes is one mission critical bolt. I mean, what's the point of putting thread locker on if you're not going to clean all the gunk off first? Look at all that. That's nasty. do the right thing. I'm not going to, like I said, show you every single bolt I do here, but I'm going to do periodic reminders throughout the build videos to do this and prove to you that I do it, and don't just stop doing it as soon as I stop recording. But with that, that's all it took. We've got about 10 bolts done for this step. Now let's get into the nitty-gritty. Alright, so for the rest of page 6, we have to do this little sub-assembly first. This is one of the servo mounts and our swash plate guide here. And in this case, there's 3 bolts to go in here. It says they're 2.5 by 6 millimeter. Everything has been in even numbers in the bolts they've given us, so I know it's these 3 right here. But I'm going to sing the praises of keeping a caliper on your workbench for just these moments. Sometimes it's not that obvious which bolts they are. I can very quickly measure the threads here and go, hey look, that's 6 millimeters of threads. I can check it this way. Look, that's 2.5 millimeters. Boom. These are obviously the right bolts. So let's take this opportunity to talk about Loctite. So in this situation, the manual calls for blue Loctite. I like to take one of the 12,432 baggies that SAB provides us on this kit and use them as a surface to put the Loctite on. So I will put a few drops of Loctite on the baggie. Important thing about Loctite, by the way, do check the expiration dates. All of the bottles have them on it right at the beginning of your build, and make sure that it has not expired. The bottles will only generally last about a year or so, and you do want to make sure that buy small bottles. Don't buy the giant ones on Amazon. Not only is Amazon Loctite sometimes a knockoff and not the real thing, but it'll expire before you ever get through that much. So that is way too much. So what I do is I roll the bolt in it, and then I'll put it on my finger and I'll roll it. So most of that is going to come off on my finger. I really just want to push it into the threads and not have a giant glob of it on there. You don't need a lot to do the work. Any of these instances where I have multiple bolts going in, I usually just really loosely tighten them at first. It's just like putting IKEA furniture together, you know? If you tighten all the bolts right out of the gate, you're hosed by the time you get to the 5th bolt. So just put them in loose, get all of them in, make sure everything's lined up, and then that's when you can go ahead and send it home, tighten it up a little more. So I'm just going to get these all started, and then that'll be good to go. Last bolt in this part. Oops. Stay on the driver, roll it on my finger. Just want it. See, there's really not that much on there. It's really just in the thread. Just roll it on your finger and get rid of that tons of extra. Doesn't do you any good, just makes a big gummy mess in there. You only need a little for it to work. Alright, so now that we're aligned, I'm going to put a little more force there. Don't need a ton. Get these nice and tight. Alright, and like I said, keep paper towel handy. You're going to want it for wiping all this Loctite that's going to be over your fingertips all night long. So, we've got this sub-assembly done. Now we're going to go ahead and attach this to the transmission with 2 3x8 millimeter bolts here. Looks like this is going to go right there. So this sits right on our transmission piece, lines up with these holes right there. So let's go ahead and do that. Set that right there. And again, I have no idea which ones are 8. I'm guessing they're these. And let's take a look. And what do you know? That's 8 millimeters right there. So it's clearly these guys right here. You know, there's sometimes, you know, when there's those 50-50 things in life, and you think, good 50-50 shot of getting this, I should get it at least half the time. Well, grabbing the right driver is like that for me. You would think that I would be able to look at the head of the bolt and grab the right driver, but I gotta tell you, 9 times out of 10 I will grab the wrong driver first and the correct one on the second try. Don't ask me why. Such is life. So, going ahead again. Again, the manual in these SAB kits shows all of these bolts in blue. and that is an indication that we should be using blue Loctite on these bolts. So we're going to follow their instructions. Again, dip your bolt in, roll it on your fingertip. That pushes it into the threads, which is where it's all going to make contact, and then take the extra. So you get all that extra on your fingertip, not all over your helicopter. And we'll get these two guys in there. Again, putting them both in sort of loose first, and we'll send it home. I'm going to put a little bit of force here. This is going to hold two of our swash plate servos here, so we definitely don't want that being even a little bit loose. And then we're going to spin round to the other side of the transmission case for our other servo mount. And it looks like we can put this piece on first onto the back of the case like so. And then we'll lastly join the other piece here. So we've got two bolts for that sitting right over here. Let's go ahead and get these Loctited. And some of these steps that are pretty simple, I probably won't go through in as much detail as these, but just kind of want to get us in a groove together, sort of see how I roll, and chit chat a little as I put this together. And it would help if I look at the picture. That looks much better. Make sure you get this little guy around the right way. There are two little recesses in this frame, and the bolt will go through those and sit flush, not the other way around, where clearly there was not enough thread sticking out. So I would stop chatting, focus on what I'm doing. Probably be better off here, but let's get this other one in, and again we'll send it home. There's also, if you're paying attention and not yakking, there's an SAB logo on the side. I'll show you in a second. That will give you further clarification as to which way is up. I'll tell you, a lot of times you'll see logos on the parts in a helicopter. Yes, to some extent they're there to look good and let everyone know what brand the helicopter is, but more often than not, they're there to help you with the build, to let you know, like, here's a part, like a bearing block that some people install the wrong way around. Do wipe anything extra from your fingers and whatnot off as you go. But as you can see here, there's an SAB logo on this frame piece that lets you know which way is up. So if I'd been paying attention, I wouldn't have started to put it in upside down. No big deal, as long as you catch it before we get too far. This guy does not look like it has a right and a wrong way. We'll just double check the picture here. But for these guys, there's a little finishing washer, they're called. They've got kind of a rounded edge that obviously goes on the outside. As you look at it, the flat side will head into what you're about to bolt. So we'll slide those onto the two bolts first. And then Loctite, because I don't want to gum up the finishing washer, which is all shiny and pretty looking, with Loctite first. See, wrong driver first, every time. Alright, so I'm going to kind of lift the bag up to get it on the end of this thread here. Hold it on my finger. Okay. The other reason I like the bag method and rolling it is that it helps. So there is, looking at this part here, this angled edge. So take a look at the picture in the manual. Let's make sure we get this around the right way. So if we orient our part correctly here, the angled edge will go this side to through the finishing washer here. So push it through our servo holder first, servo bracket we'll call it, and just get that sort of finger tight. Get a little Loctite on our other screw here. So we were having this conversation at the field the other day about Loctite, and two of my club mates, quick shout out to Sean Hall and Brian Birdsong, big fans of red Loctite. They're telling me that Mr. Nick Maxwell is also a big fan of using red everywhere. They fly a lot harder than I do, so I don't necessarily subscribe to that. You'll see I like to use red in a fair number of places, but certainly not everywhere. So manual calls for blue. I'm going blue. I'll save the red for the hypercritical stuff. All right, now that we got this all aligned, let's go ahead and send it home, get it nice and tight. Just check this other guy. There we go. And that is the end of page 6. Our transmission is starting to take shape. All right, moving on to page 7. And the first thing it's going to have us do is install our servos. So before we install our servos, it's very important that we center them. What do I mean by that? So all of our servos in our models, our transmitter tells them whether to go left or right or back to center. And it's really important when we set up our control geometry that we get our servo horns aligned with this center point. So when they ship from the factory, they are at who knows where in their travel. So you need to plug them into a servo tester. There's lots of different manufacturers. And send them a center pulse. So look for a servo tester from your favorite distributor. HeliDirect certainly has a lot to choose from. And get them centered, and then install your servo horn. So we're going to go ahead and do that now. So make sure when you plug your servo into the tester, you get the signal wire on the correct side. There it goes. These are Theta servos, by the way. I'm a big fan of these. These are the Razor C1s. Theta makes some fantastic servos. Been rock solid for me. Real big fan of these. Certainly, there's a lot of manufacturers of servos to choose from. But I really can't recommend these Theta servos enough. Big fan. I've had great success with them. So, next step, servo horns. Servo horns are not included in the kit. They're typically not included in most heli kits. Couple things that are important in selecting them. The first is that the geometry or the control geometry of a helicopter is very specific to that model. And in the manual, if you look around, it'll tell you that what it wants the linkage ball that goes into the end of the servo arm here to be 18 millimeters from the center of the servo spline. So you'll want to check that. How do you check that? With your handy dandy digital caliper. So you grab the caliper, check center to center, and lo and behold, these are perfect at 18. Now, a lot of people will tell you which servo arms are better. A lot of it's personal preference to an extent. Some people are big fans of metal arms that are designed to bend in the event of a crash. SAB makes some great carbon fiber type that are also designed to break in a crash. These are made by Theta. I've had good luck with these as well. But the idea there is that in the event of a crash, they'll break and sacrifice themselves and protect your servo gears from any damage. So choose your servo horns wisely. Make sure they're that correct diameter. Now that we've got this servo set up, the elevator servo actually will go horizontal. So this type of orientation here, back over the body of the servo itself. We're going to install the balls on these first, which we'll do in a moment. The front two Cyclic servos, SAB actually includes a handy dandy little jig for. These servos, I'll show you in here. So they fit on these brackets here in the front, and will go in this orientation. So we want them to be perfectly horizontal when they're in that bracket. So what this little guy does is it gives us, as we press it against the servo, and let me hold it up here for you all. It gives us an example of what that is. So this line right here, where this little tab is on the jig, that's the horizontal we want to aim for. So when we install the control horn here, we want this as close to perfect on that as possible. The best case for every helicopter is to get everything as mechanically perfect. I mean, before we turn on radios and get everything dialed in and can tweak things, let's get it mechanically as perfect as it can be. So this is one of the cases. Take your time. Make sure you set your servo horn angles correctly as per the manual. Make sure that distance to the servo ball is correct, and go from there. All right, with that, let's start digging into mounting the servo balls on these horns, and then go from there. All right, so next we're going to work on getting our servo balls onto our servo arms. So what I've done so far is just to go ahead and get the bolt through the servo arm itself. I've not put any Loctite on it yet, because I don't know what these servo arms are made of entirely. There might be some plastic in there, and I don't want to weaken them. This, for the servo balls, is one of those places where we definitely want to use red Loctite. We do not want these coming off. The servo arm is essentially a sacrificial crash part. So we don't care about that anymore, whether it's coming back or not. So I'm going to take this and our little dab of red Loctite and work a little dab onto the end of the screw, and then take our swash ball and screw that onto the end. And I'll probably run it back and forth a little bit, make sure I work that red Loctite into those threads. And then I'm going to work the bolt against the ball. Counter tighten these together. Don't want to go crazy because that servo horn is just some sort of composite material. And then we have our first servo ball mounted on our arm. I'm going to go ahead and do this 2 more times, 1 for each servo, and then we'll go ahead and start getting these aligned. Alright, so now, first thing we're going to do is work on our elevator servo. Now this one, the arm will be running back dead center over the body of the servo. So you can see the way the servo is aligned there. We've still got it connected to our tester, so we'll just make sure we're still in center. There we go, we're back at center. And then I'm going to want to do my best to get this aligned as close as possible to center. Now I'm probably not going to be able to get it dead on. It's slightly off. So servos have these splines in the, you can see them at the top here, these splines here. And that means the servo arm is, sort of ratchets in position. So unless you have an adjustable servo arm, or servos with, which actually these do have software where you can adjust the center point as well, but most servos do not. So you'll do that in your radio sub trim. So I like to use red Loctite also for the servo attachment screws. A little more in there. I use it sparingly. You'll have to put a little bit of heat on these to get them removed, but these are just screws I don't want coming out. These are what holds the control system together. And a 700 size helicopter out of control coming towards humans, not good. So I err on the side of caution here. Just going to put a little on, and then I'm going to work almost all of this out. So most of this is ending up on my finger. I'm just working it into the threads. Got my paper towel over here, just off camera. And then I will go ahead and tighten this down. Nice and snug. All right, and with that is our elevator servo done. I'm going to set that aside until we mount it. Now we're going to work on the Cyclic servos. We have to mount these servos at kind of an interesting angle, and they have this little jig piece here that's going to help us with that. So looking at this, I'm going to align this piece, and I'll spin this to the camera in a little bit, slightly differently, just to see how this is going to work. So these servos will mount in this way, with the servo on this side of the bracket, come like this, and then the servo arms will angle out. So let's first get this plugged into our servo tester so that we get it centered there. Go ahead and do that real quick. Again, checking where the signal wire goes. And then checking it. Great, that works perfect. That is now centered. And then we're going to look at the manual really carefully here to see how this is all going to work. So this is going to go in this direction. And we're going to kind of mock it up. And then the servo arm is going to want to go parallel with the ground or perpendicular to the main shaft as best as possible. So with that sort of lightly mocked up, we can move the jig in here like so. And now we've got a reference, right? This is where the angle that our servo arm wants to be at. So we're going to go ahead and I'll move this closer to you in just a second. I want to sort of look down as best I can. I've got this jig pressed up against the side of the servo case. And now I'm going to get this angle of the servo arm. I'm going to find the spline that gets me as close as possible. That looks like the one here. So looking at this again, it's not perfect. I'm going to have to do some slight tweaking later, but I can unplug this now. Let me get this a little closer to the lens for you. So you can see from the jig here that I'm as close to that as possible. I had to choose between a couple of splines, and that's the best option. So we'll go ahead and get the screw in. Now, I have not done this yet, but I'm not going to make fun of anybody else that has, because I'm sure it'll happen to me one day. But there are plenty of folks in a helicopter build that forget to put this very mission critical screw in. And this is the screw that will hold that servo arm down to the servo. Again, I'm going to use a little red Loctite on this screw here. SAB actually recommends green, which is even stronger than red in the manual. I'm going to use red. It's okay to deviate from the manual a little bit sometimes. Once you get a little more experience, kind of understand the way these things work, you start forming personal preferences, and it's okay to follow those. So don't be afraid to do that. So go ahead and tighten this down. And then I'm going to put this on this side because I know it's going to go like that. Again, you can see how this will end up about perpendicular to the main shaft, even though the servo's at an angle with our center point. So put this guy on that side so we remember that he's that side servo. Let's go ahead and get our last Cyclic servo unwrapped. We'll plug it into the tester. Let's check the direction of our signal wire. We'll check the operation of the servo. That all looks great. All right, now this goes on the other side. So I'm kind of a visual thinker, so it helps me to sort of align these. So servo attachment point at the top of the frame, it's going to angle this way. Let's take our servo horn, and we know we'll just sort of mock it up loosely like so. I'm going to leave this plugged into the tester, so if I bump it, it won't get deterred. I'm going to bring my template over. I'll slime it. All right, so this definitely needs to move a spline. That looks pretty gosh darn close to the best option. And then I can unplug it from the tester now. I'll show it to you all. So you can see that's not what we get the template lined up. There we go. So that's about the best alignment we can get with the choice of splines. So we'll go ahead and not forget, because it would be great to talk about it and then forget about it on camera. Be classic. Work the red Loctite here into the threads. And then again, push it in, take some of it off on our finger, wipe it off on our paper towel. Sure, you're going to be tired of hearing me say, wipe it off on the paper towel by the end of this. Get that nice and tight. All right, and now I know that this is the servo that goes on this side. All right, with that, I have about 1,232 servo mounting screws to clean. I'm going to go ahead and work on that, and we'll be right back. So after getting all 12 of the servo screws ready, I have gone ahead and installed 2 of them. We're going to go through the third install, but they're all the same approach. They all install from the outside. So the elevator servo installs from the outside against the frame with a servo saver. That's this clip piece right here. They look like this guy right here. And so it goes servo right against the frame, servo saver, and then the 2 bolts through. I like to get all 4 of my bolts aligned first, and then drive them in loosely, and then tighten them home once you have the servo exactly where you want it. So same thing with the Cyclic servos, 4 bolts straight through, servo on the outside of the frame. Super straightforward. Let's go ahead and put the last servo in now. So the top of the servo, where the motor spline is, goes towards the top here of our piece. I'm going to take a servo saver here, get that ready on the bench, and get one of our screws ready. Same rodeo, roll it in Loctite, rub it on my finger there. We're going to go through the servo saver and into that little cutout on the servo saver is going to go facing down. And it's a little fiddly here to get the first 1 or 2 in. I like to go sort of opposite corners at first. So there's our first. I'm just going to snug this a little bit just to hold the servo down. And then go ahead and get the opposite bolt through. Get a little bit of Loctite on there. Same thing, roll it on my finger to get rid of a bunch of it. And those of you who are astutely observing will notice that there's a little bit of Loctite that's dry on these threads already. Had a little bit of a camera snafu with this segment of footage. So reshooting this, so that's hence the dried Loctite you see on the end of these bolts. Didn't quite record the whole thing. So just doing a quick recap here, getting you caught back up. We'll get this last servo in. This is bolt number 3. And then lastly, number 4. And then I like to do the same thing with each servo. So there's a little play to deal with variances and sizes of servos by various manufacturers. And so I'll show you in just a moment. The servo itself can actually kind of wiggle around a little bit in here. And what that means is that the servo, loosen that first. It's a little, get all these a little loose. Can move around a little bit inside this frame. So there it is wiggling around. You can probably hear it too. So I'm going to push these back against the frame and down as far as they will go. I did the exact same thing on the other side because we want our geometry to be as similar as possible between all these servos. If the other servo was lifted up high and then the other one pushed down, I mean, these are slight subtle differences, but everything you can do in a helicopter to keep things geometry-wise consistent, exactly the same. Mechanically, it just leads to a better flying helicopter. All right. And with that, we have all 3 of our Cyclic servos installed. And we can move on from there. With that is the end of the first build installment on the Goblin Raw. At this point, we have our main drivetrain assembly. We've got our 3 Cyclic servos mounted. I've gone ahead and just sort of bundled up their leads just to get them out of the way for the rest of the build. We'll deal with wiring towards the end here. We've got our pulleys mounted and our servos good to go. I'm going to break these build videos up much in the way that most of us build helis, which is when we can find time in little sort of 2-hour chunks. I know there's a few of us lucky enough to be able to do these giant build marathons, but I tend to do a couple hours here and there when I can, so I'll break the videos up in the same way. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy the video or have questions, feel free to let us know in the comments. Certainly appreciate the feedback, and we'll see you in the next installment. Thanks.
HeliDirect!